computer. I mean, I'm recording the audio, which is mainly the thing, but I might as well record the video. Um, there are those who have said all along that Russia wants to eliminate Ukraine from completely. Like, there's no stop. There's like the Polish leader. These individuals are sort of saying that Russia's insatiable appetite for imperial domination is not going to stop with Ukraine. It's not going to stop in the Donbass. I don't really believe that at all. I think that's just some nonsense propaganda that people on our Western governments and media have made up to create this sort of boogeyman image of Russia being this endless sort of threat to our overall national security. Would you still agree, or do you agree with that idea, or do you think this is really just, as has always been said, a way of sort of creating a buffer around Russia for its own security, i.e., NATO's expansion and so forth?
Well, I agree with you. I don't think that the Russians have any plan to march on Europe. I can see no conceivable logic or reason why they would want to do that. I think that when they started out, they had no plan to conquer the whole of Ukraine. They were concerned about their national security. They were concerned about NATO's eastward expansion. They were concerned about the threat to Russian speakers in the Donbass, which is, of course, a major issue for them because Russian speakers are in the Donbass are essentially Russians, and their interconnections with Russia and other Russians, and no Russian government could look the other way from that problem. And I think that the Russians, for many years, attempted to find a diplomatic solution to this with the Minsk agreement, with the various other negotiations. And then when they felt that they'd been pushed into a corner, they sent their army in, and they still sought negotiations, and an agreement was almost reached, and that agreement fell apart because the Western powers didn't want it to happen. And well, now we are where we are. And I think, like Alex, it will be the Russians who will decide what the future of Ukraine is going to be. But certainly I have no belief that they want to advance further westwards. I just don't see why they would be interested in that at all. Can I just add to what Alex said? Because I think he's absolutely right. I think we're coming to the end of the Ukraine war. I mean, there's still fighting to do, a lot of fighting, but it's now clear to everybody that Russia is going to win. What we are far from seeing ended is the Ukraine conflict, which is something completely different.
Okay.
The Ukraine conflict can be kept going for a very long time indeed. You can continue to provide funding. You can set up a government in exile in London or Paris or Washington or whatever. You can continue to impose sanctions on Russia. You can refuse to recognize the outcome of whatever military victory the Russians achieve. And that continues the tension in Europe that we have already seen, and the conflict in Europe that we have already seen. And that can still be used to justify more appropriations, more funding bills, more seizures of Russian assets, more sanctions. That can be preserved and continued almost indefinitely. And I think that is the policy at the moment.
Well, it's a very cynical approach, and it's also, I mean, the inhumanity of that is just astounding. I mean, I don't know. There's so many things going through my head, but thinking about the casualty rates right now on the Ukrainian side compared to the Russian side are just, there's just no. I mean, it's just shocking. I go on Telegram every day, and I see, in various sort of military channels, images of dozens of dead Ukrainians lying just strewn across battlefields, rotting in the sun. I don't see how. I mean, obviously they can't sustain a military campaign with those kinds of losses. So what are you suggesting? It would sort of turn into a partisan, like back to the sort of Stepan Bandera days, or what are we talking here?
Well, just quickly before Alex steps in. I mean, they will try. I think they will want to create a partisan war in Ukraine, but even if they can't manage that, they can still continue with the conflict. They can still continue to recognize a government in exile. They can still try to make sure that that government retains the seat, Ukraine's seat in the United Nations. The United States has maintained for many years a conflict with China over Taiwan.
Right.
It continued to recognize the government in exile in Taiwan. It continues to create and restart the conflict in Taiwan to this day. So even if they don't get their insurgency, which I think they are planning, actually, I think that is what they want to see, they can still keep this situation tense and difficult. And they can say that, yes, we will agree to good relations with the Russians, but only if they fully withdraw from all of Ukraine, agree that the government that we recognize is reestablished there. And then only then will sanctions be lifted and, Russian assets be returned. And only once the Russians have paid reparations and that kind of thing. And they can use that to keep Europe divided from Russia. And they can also use that, as they're using it at the moment, to discredit anybody who criticizes what they're going to do. They can continue to say that they're Putin agents and that kind of thing. And going back to what Alex said, they can seize Russian assets, which I think is absolutely the next plan. Alex can talk about that further. And also they can, continue to pass bills and appropriations through Congress, get the European Union to do the same, and do all of those things. It's important to understand that a conflict can continue even beyond the point where the fighting itself stops. And I think that is quite plausibly what we're looking at now.
Alex?
Yeah, the conflict will continue. I agree with Alexander. I think he said it. He summed it up perfectly. The war is going to end. Everyone understands that Russia has won this war and will win this war, but they'll keep the conflict going forever. I mean, I believe Assange said something along the lines of the goal of wars is to turn them into forever wars.
Yeah,
to turn these conflicts into forever wars, and that's what they're going to do. And though the sanctions are never going to be rolled back. I mean, have the sanctions in Cuba been rolled back? They've tried, but it's impossible. The sanctions against Iran. I mean, these sanctions are never going to be rolled back. The minute they steal the 300 billion in frozen assets, I mean, you're never coming back from that. But that is an act of war against the Russian Federation. But we're not going to come back from an action like that. When I mean we, I mean the West and our relationship with Russia. And it's not only going to be a relationship with Russia, it's going to be a relationship with the rest of the world.
right.
Because the rest of the world is going to see this and they're going to be horrified. They're going to be horrified that the West, that Europe and the US is going to steal assets of another country. This is going to be catastrophic, and I think the neocons and the neolibs, not any difference between the two anymore. They've decided that the world is going to be separated and split. They're going to rule over the 20% of the planet, and the 80% is going to be moving towards this multipolar world. I honestly believe that they have taken the decision to rule over this little kingdom of theirs that they've constructed, which is effectively the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and then wherever else in the world they can cause trouble, they will. But that's effectively what we're looking at. It's almost like the Cold War, but in this instance, I guess we're living in the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. I guess that's the way to look at it.
Kind of, yeah. That's an interesting analogy for sure. Alex, the other day you quoted in one of your posts, sort of flip-flop Macron, something to do with his recent statement that if Ukraine loses this war, I'm paraphrasing here, and I can't remember exactly what you were talking about, but I think it was Macron said something about, that would be the end of this hegemonic. Was it Macron that said that?
Yeah, it was Macron. He was speaking at the Sorbonne University, and he basically said that Europe could die if they lose this conflict. That Europe could possibly, the EU could possibly go away. And basically, it was Macron making the push for Europe to not be a vassal to the United States, and for Europe to become a great power alongside China and the United States. That was basically Macron's pitch, which is nonsense. It's nonsense, but basically it's just Macron, and we've talked about this at length on the Duran. It's basically Macron's way of calling for more Europe, more EU. Alexander says it all the time. The way the EU solves their problems is they call for more EU. That's their answer to everything. More EU is going to solve the difficulties that the EU has put us in. So that's basically Macron's pitch. We need more EU. We need more EU funding. How are we going to get more EU funding so that we can rise up to the level of China? Well, we're going to have to figure out a way to put Eurobonds in place, and war bonds, and EU direct taxation, because that's how we're going to get the revenue in order to finance Macron's vision of AI and biotech and big pharma and weapons manufacturing. And this is a 10-year plan. It's nonsense. Tomorrow, Macron is going to be kissing up to the US again. I mean, this is Macron. Says one thing one day, the next day he says something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, a few months ago he was calling for French boots on the ground in Ukraine, wasn't he? So
this is
I
Macron.
mean, speaking of which, do you think there's ever a possibility that anything like that could happen with? I mean, I know there are NATO troops in the field in Ukraine. I mean, it's perfectly obvious. You can see, images of them being captured and killed, and you hear people in the field with American accents, so that they're there as advisors, or however you want to call it. But that was the same with Vietnam in 1962, 63, right? It inevitably led to American boots on the ground. Do you think there's ever a possibility that could happen in Ukraine if things really got tougher?
I think it is possible, but I think the greatest risk of it is actually starting to ebb. I think that a few months ago, when the full realization that military defeat is staring the West in the face in Ukraine, there was a lot of panic, a lot of anger, a lot of crazy schemes were put together. There's still, I think, plans to try and hold on to Ukraine west of the Dnieper. Possibly there's still plans to send troops to help the Ukrainians hold the west bank of the Dnieper. But I think what's probably happening is that they're getting advice from their polling agencies, which do exist. I mean, all governments take polls all the time, and from their militaries, which are telling them two things. One, the line of the Dnieper cannot be held, that it can't be done. And secondly, that the European public overwhelmingly will oppose it. They will not want to see their troops go to Ukraine to fight and die there, and for the whole of Europe to be dragged into a war with Russia. And Josep Borrell are incredibly militaristic and belligerent and aggressive and incompetent foreign minister of the EU, if I can call him that, the high representative for foreign policy in the EU. He's now admitted that Europeans are not prepared to go and die and fight for Ukraine on the Ukrainian battlefields. So I think that moment of thinking this was there. I think Macron pushed it. I think there was support for it in the US as well for some people. But I think in the end, I think that people just realized that politically it was just too dangerous and that it just couldn't be pulled off. So, though the possibility that something like that will happen can never be completely excluded, I think the most dangerous moment for that has probably gone.
And to sort of veer into territory that's even more threatening, the likelihood of which, of course, can never be ruled out, is a nuclear conflict. Do you think that there's a possibility that, I mean, I sort of don't see Russia starting anything like that. You know, they seem to generally have a sort of sense of restraint that is unmatched, I would think, by the West. You know, some of the things that have been done to Russia had happened to the United States. We'd already be firing nuclear, you know, ICBMs at Russia by now, like Nord Stream. Speaking of which, I just got a little reminder from Liz, my producer, about Larry Johnson's talk at the United Nations, you know, talking about Nord Stream and the need for a real proper investigation. But just before we get into that, I mean, Scott Ritter has been going on and on and on for several years now, talking about the dangers of a nuclear confrontation. Do you think that we're still in that territory, or do you think that's not a possibility?
I'll just say what I think and then turn over to Alex here. But I think that, again, the possibility exists. In fact, I would go further and I would say we have never been closer to that at any point in my lifetime, at least not since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which happened when I was still a teeny weeny little thing, and I don't remember it. But I have never known a time when the tensions between the Russians and the West have been so great that one could just about imagine the thing like that would happen. But again, I think in the end, the survival instinct, the self-preservation instinct is going to kick in. I think it's well understood that sending European armies to Ukraine and fighting the Russians conventionally is going to fail. I think it's also understood that the Americans will not willingly do it either. I think nobody wants to die for Ukraine, which is what Borrell has just said. And I think that I don't think it will happen. I think in the end, we will draw back and we will let events in Ukraine take their course. And as I said, move towards moving from a war to a conflict and perpetuating that conflict indefinitely, or at least trying to do so.
Yeah, well, just to put a cap on the nuclear issue, of course, there's always the possibility for mistakes. I mean, it's clearly documented over the course of the last 70 odd years or more that there have been numerous occasions when we were really this. I'm not even talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's events that have happened in the relatively recent past where we were this close to it, but there's always that possibility, I suppose. Alex, could you talk about Larry Johnson's talk at the UN?
It was a great speech.
I mean, I saw
great speech from Larry.
Yeah.
Look, I think what Larry is saying is what all of us in this space have been saying. It's also what the Russian delegation, what the Russian ambassador and the first deputy Polyansky, what they've been saying at the UN as well. China the other day also talked about an investigation into Nord Stream. It's very simple. Everyone is wondering, why is there no investigation into Nord Stream? And everyone knows the answer to that question. But I mean, we're all kind of going around in a circle saying, okay, look, we kind of know what happened and who did it, but let's get an investigation so we can be certain as to maybe the details. What were the details as to how all of this went down? But I mean, we all understand what was behind the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, and we also understand why Germany and why the European Union and why the United States are so against an investigation. I believe the Russian ambassador to the UN said this is the theater of the absurd, and he's right. It's absurd.
Well, using the old Occam's razor theory, the most obvious answer is usually the answer. Like
everyone knows what happened. To a certain extent, I think we just all want the confirmation and the details. I'm curious to learn the details. How did they do it? But I don't think I'm doubting who did it.
Let's call a horse by the color that it is. Who did it, and why did they do it?
Yeah, I mean,
for the listeners,
it's absurd.
People who might not know, tell me who did it and why did they do it?
Oh, you're asking me that question?
Yeah, I know the answer. You know the answer, but there may be people who are watching that are.
Well, I think the Biden White House, I think Biden himself and Victoria Nuland, they basically said what they were going to do if Germany started to slide back from cutting off Russian gas. I mean, they said it. They said it in public, in press conferences. So, I mean, how this went about and who was involved, who were the players? Was Ukraine involved? Were some European nations involved? Some EU nations? I think these are the details that we would like to have. But no doubt, a great power had to have done this. This wasn't an easy operation. This wasn't something that a couple of divers in the Andromeda yacht, a couple of 5 or 6 divers in the Andromeda yacht could have pulled off.
It wasn't Gilligan and the skipper.
Yeah, it was a Gilligan. Yeah, obviously this isn't how this went down. But what are the details? The effect was that you basically sent a message to Germany. There is going to be no Russian gas. I think this scared the hell out of Germany, if you want my honest opinion. I think Germany saw this because Germany was considering,
so in a
turning on the gas with Nord Stream. I mean, they were saying this is hurting our economy, and they were sliding back. And I think the message was crystal clear: there is going to be no turning back. And once that pipeline got blown up and Germany got the hell scared out of it, they've been very, very loyal to the people that are running things. They haven't doubted Project Ukraine for 1 second. It's that event.
So in certain terms, it was a kind of a scare tactic to scare not only Germany, I think, but most of the European Union countries into getting in line. Would that be a reasonable assessment?
Alexander, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I no question. I mean, it's a demonstration of how utterly ruthless the United States is prepared to be, because everybody knows that in some form or other it was the United States. How utterly ruthless the United States is going to be, and how any country that wants to backtrack on this, at least any of the major countries that want to backtrack out of this, that they can expect this kind of forcible retaliation. I think exactly as Alex says, it absolutely terrified them. And of course, in the meantime, it has had the benefit for the United States of cutting economic and political links between Germany and Russia, and between the Central European states of Europe and the Russians. So, it's cut the umbilical cord, if you like, that linked the Russians with Europe, which the United States was never happy about at all. I'm going to just make one observation about Nord Stream and what happened, which is, of course, if one day someone in the West, and it would have to be in the United States, decides that the conflict with Russia has to be ended and we have to find some way back, then, of course, Nord Stream, the problem of Nord Stream is there, and you can perhaps finally reveal what happened, what actually happened, and perhaps change perceptions about how the conflict began and who instigated it and who started it, and start dismantling this narrative of Russian aggression, which has been constructed but don't expect that to happen anytime soon. At the time being, anybody who speaks out is going to find themselves in serious trouble. I mean, anybody, any position of authority who speaks out is going to find themselves in serious trouble. And for at least, the next 10, 20 years, the omerta, which is what we have about this, is going to apply. And it's omerta. It's the code of silence. It's descended on everybody. It's a mafia hit, and all the accomplices are, observing the code of silence. You talked about the UN Security Council session where Larry made that wonderful presentation. Well, you saw it in observation. You saw it there. The Americans, the Europeans, the French, the British.
While Larry was talking, the American ambassador, I think he was on his phone or something. It was like he wasn't even paying attention or something. It's like, I'll get this guy out of here, will you?
Yeah. I remember, just real quick, I remember when the whole Nord Stream thing went down, and I was doing a video, and I said, it's real simple to figure out who did this, because if it was Russia, if it was anybody else, then you would have had Greenpeace and Greta Thunberg, and everyone would have been outraged at this environmental disaster that had just taken place. But I said the fact that you see no one saying anything about the environmental disaster that had just unfolded because you blew up this huge pipeline, and all of this stuff is just leaking and infecting the oceans and going up into the air. The fact that you had not one environmental organization in the West raise their voice, to me, right there, it just says it all,
isn't it? Yeah. It's definitely telling. I mean, it's interesting because in this country, I can't say for the rest of the planet, but certainly in this country, there's still a very strong sentiment that Ukraine are the victims. I mean, the people are always the victims. I don't care whether you're Russian or Ukrainian or Israeli or Palestinian. I mean, people who get caught up in all of this political nonsense are, they're just mostly people just trying to live their lives. But there's still this image of Ukraine being oppressed by this dictator. Putin is looked at as a complete lunatic dictator, yet they give him all this credit for being smart at the same time, which is really ironic. But it was a war of aggression, and there were ways to have had it prevented, but Russia didn't want to do that, which quite frankly is almost the exact opposite of reality in my mind. It seems quite obvious that Russia seems to have, even Pravda Ukraine printed an article last week where one of the top Ukrainian ministers sort of said as much. He said, there was an agreement, and we were told not to go through with it in no uncertain terms, like keep fighting this war. We're with you. Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev back in 2022, and all of this death and destruction and bloodshed could have been avoided. I mean, what do you think the total number of casualties for the Ukrainian? I mean, I know Russia seems to be fairly transparent with their numbers. Doesn't seem the same way with Ukrainian numbers. Are we talking like 500,000 casualties in this war so far, do you think, or more or less?
That's the Russian figure. I mean, if you believe the Russians, what the Russians say, then it is 500,000 casualties. Of course, that includes dead and wounded, and I think we must be clear about that. We're not talking about 500,000 people killed,
right,
but killed and severely wounded, and that is a horrific total. And I personally believe it. I think it is in the ballpark of being right. You see the evidence of this every day in Ukraine. You see the cemeteries filling up. You see the reports of the military units enormously reduced in size. You see the interviews of the Ukrainian soldiers saying that in my unit, everybody but me is dead. There's been lots and lots of reports like that. So I think it is about right. And yes, Ukraine is a victim. Unquestionably it is. it has been a victim, but ultimately it's been a victim of that small group of people that Alex was talking about at the beginning of the program, who wanted to pursue policies both of grift and of immense geopolitical ambition, and who were prepared to sacrifice Ukraine to achieve their various objectives, and who are prepared to do that still. Just look at the cynicism of what we just heard from the United States. So one report, I think in the Wall Street Journal, tells us that it was the United States that forced or pressured Ukraine to expedite its mobilization law, bringing down the mobilization age to 25, and is pressing Ukraine to round up all the young men and to send them to the battle. And another article simultaneously coming out in the Washington Post, which says that the United States knows that Ukraine is lying about the true number of its casualties. So they're going to throw more men into battle to fight for a Ukrainian government which is suffering far more losses than it admits to. And of course, the United States is a party to that lie. Now, you cannot be more cynical than that.
Well, who did I can't remember. I saw something just the other day where Ukraine is now calling for other European countries to send people who left Ukraine back. How the heck are they going to do that?
Repatriate them.
How on earth are they
Well,
going to?
they've already said how they're going to do it. I mean, Alexander can get into the international legalities of this, because I do believe you are breaking international law. But how they're going to do it is simple. You cut off their consular services. So if you're a Ukrainian and you're living in Poland, eventually you're going to need your ID updated. Eventually you're going to need some sort of embassy services. Maybe you're just walking in the streets and police stop you and they say, I need to see your residency papers, which is very common in Europe. If you're a resident of another country in Europe, you usually get some papers or some documentation which says that you're allowed to stay in this country for whatever reasons, for 6 months or for a year, or for whatever. A policeman could stop you in the street and say, let me see your papers. And so you're going to need some sort of contact with your embassy or your consulate. And so they've already cut off their consulate services to Ukrainians living in Europe. Eventually, they're going to cut off their banking services. And they're going to have to either go on the run and be a persona non grata and somehow figure out a way to live, living in via the black market or somehow, for lack of a better word, living underground, or they're going to have to go back to Kiev, go back to Ukraine in order to renew whatever paperwork they need to be renewed or any banking services that they need done. And that's when they'll be placed into the database for military service, and most likely they will be sent to the front lines.
Well, I suppose they could also, like, I have a friend who's Ukrainian. He's a young guy. He's 25, 26 years old. He left. He's from Odessa, and he left Ukraine right after the war started because, for obvious reasons, he didn't want to go and get his. He's half Russian, he's half Ukrainian. Very typical person. But I could see, perhaps the government of Ukraine might start putting pressure on their families too, right? Like, hey, if you don't get back here, we're going to give your family a hard time. And so there's all kinds of different ways of applying pressure, I suppose, on someone. But it's a tragic situation. I mean, I interviewed an Israeli settler a couple of weeks ago for my show, just to get like that narrative. And I said to that person, I said, do you ever get the feeling like Israel is just being used as a forget the exact word I used, not a puppet, but proxy, like Israel's being used in the same way that you could sort of say that about Ukraine, like for this larger geopolitical game, countries like Ukraine and Syria, gosh, Iraq, the list goes on. These places are sold as requiring democracy and freedom, yet you don't really see a lot of it. It's not really a question. I was just more of an observation. But I suppose my last question regarding Ukraine would be, in sort of very obvious sort of military terms, where are things at right now? I know that it seems like every day Russia is making advances. Is this true?
It is, mate. It is true. It is absolutely true, and those advances are accelerating. And there's wide expectations that there's going to be a bigger offensive in the summer. Now, I think everybody who's following the war closely feels that there's some way still to go. I mean, there's still a Ukrainian army. It is still fighting. Most military units are still obeying orders, even though increasing numbers of them are not. So we're not at the end, but we are at the beginning of the end. It may stretch out over many months. We'll just have to see. If I could just go back to some of the points that we discussed just now, repatriating, forcing people to go back to their countries in order to fight and die when they don't want to do that is, of course, directly contrary to international law. In the event that these people are stripped of their citizenship but still don't want to go back, they are, properly speaking, refugees. There is extensive law governing how refugees ought to be treated. There's a refugee convention which dates back to 1950. By the way, I should say that I used to work in this area, so I know what I'm talking about. And there is a fundamental principle against what's called refoulement, which is the expulsion of refugees back to their country of origin, where they stand risk of being persecuted and, in the event they're sent into the army, killed. But that is exactly what I think we're going to see happen. Now, some of these people, because, they're very resourceful, people in these situations often are, they might try and escape, they may try and hide in the West, they may try and obtain refugee status, their asylum status. They will face, I think, hostility from the authorities, hostility probably from the courts, which will be terrible. But we've seen how Western courts actually behave in the Assange case, for example. And, I worked in the courts myself. So I've been very shocked by the Assange case and the way that was conducted. And given the way that has been conducted, I have little hope that the courts or the authorities will observe the law in this instance. But, they might try to do that. A lot of them, I think, might say to themselves, if we can't stay in the West, we need to leave and try and go elsewhere, maybe to Russia. But how do they get to Russia if they don't have travel papers? So it is going to be a terrible thing that is going to happen. Again, the cynicism of it and the cruelty of it is beyond all reason. And coming back exactly to the point that you were making now, yes, at the end of all of this, a lot of Ukrainians, perhaps the critical mass of Ukrainians, perhaps even more than a critical mass of Ukrainians, are going to come to the conclusion that, say, the Chechens have already come to, which is that they have been used in a geopolitical game. And they will turn against us in the West. They will remember what we did to them, and they will not easily forgive us for it. You see today that the Chechens, who 20 years ago were fighting the Russians, are now on the vanguard of the Russian army in Ukraine. And that's why, because they feel they were used. And who knows, one day Ukrainians may feel about us in exactly the same way. But that's not going to stop us acting in the way we are, in the way we are.
Yeah. Well, I want to switch gears now, just to get a little bit of time in, just to discuss the current events with, the Assange case, of course, is actually what I wanted to mention as you were speaking was just we've sort of seen over the past couple of years, like almost every norm regarding international law is sort of literally like torn up and thrown out down the toilet. I mean, seriously. I mean, there are lines that just keep getting crossed in terms of that. And the reason I'm saying this is because what we're seeing with what's happening to the Palestinians, there's every day that you see an example of just this goes against every convention, the International Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Convention, everything that you can possibly imagine as being just blindly ignored and almost made a mockery of, yet we're somehow led to believe that this is necessary. That this is this, under normal circumstances, yeah, these rules should apply, but these aren't normal circumstances. I mean,
well, can I again just jump in?
Yeah.
And before Alex continues, you are absolutely correct. And again, once upon a time, as a person who used to work within a legal system, a Western legal system, the British to be precise, I would not have believed this possible. I would not believe it possible, for example, that 2 mass graves could be discovered in Gaza with absolutely horrifying information about what was done to the people who were found in those mass graves, at least evidence of that, and that nobody in the West would talk about it. No government is interested. No commentary appears about it. The media in Britain is silent. The media in the United States is largely silent. Contrast that, for example, with the Bucha affair in Kiev, when a small number of people were found dead on the streets. Huge international uproar. Well, what we discovered 2 mass graves in Gaza, but nobody has anything to say. And in fact, they all but pretend that it doesn't exist. I would never have believed it. But this is what empire does to you. And remember, I live in Britain, which was formerly an empire. And to some extent, in its own mindset, still is. And of course, if you allow that kind of policy, that kind of thinking to dominate how you behave, then it opens the way for you to do terrible things. Now, can I just say, I live in the center of the empire. Alex lived in a province of that British Empire. And he can tell you, and his family knows all about it, that the British used to do terrible things in the places that they controlled. And now we're doing that exactly the same way, but on a far larger scale and in a much more public way, because the world has become more open and more informed. But our media control is trying to prevent us from knowing about it. And I am shocked, I'm stunned. I wouldn't have believed it possible, but I'm not in denial about it. I can see that it is true.
Well, I've been back and forth down to New York City, and the other day I was near the Columbia University campus, and boy, oh boy, I mean, it's like the security presence. It's like, what are they? They're the powers that be are definitely afraid. These students are making a huge impact, and I think it's a beautiful example to show that America isn't just run by a bunch of lunatics, and that all Americans are not, as evil as people would naturally start to imagine, seeing these things going on. So, Alex, do you want to weigh in on any of that, what we were just discussing? You've got any thoughts on that?
I mean, with the protests, I think it's just interesting that you have these protests across all the campuses in the United States, and if these protests, if something similar was happening in Iran or China or Russia, the United States would be calling for regime change.
Yeah.
So I think the hypocrisy of it all. But you notice that the United States and Iran and China, they're not making statements saying, this is the Biden White House is illegitimate and Biden is a dictator and he should be removed from power. You don't hear those statements coming from these countries.
Right.
which is interesting. I think it shows you that they are a level above when it comes to diplomacy. As far as what Alexander said with everything that's happening in Israel, I think the world is not going to forgive the United, especially the United States. Not even Israel, especially the United States. The world's not going to forgive the United States for what's happening in Gaza, and they're not going to forgive the hypocrisy of it all, because you have, for example, Blinken was in China, and he delivers this ultimatum to the Chinese, and he says in his ultimatum statement that the Chinese need to stop funding Putin's war machine, because if the Chinese stop funding Putin's war machine, then Russia won't last another minute in this conflict. Meanwhile, the United States has just approved 61 billion to Ukraine. They approved 26 billion to Israel to fund that war machine, and they approved 8 billion to Taiwan to get another war going. The hypocrisy of it all is stunning. It's absolutely stunning, and people understand that. People see it. I mean, at least the people that want to open up their eyes.
Well, unfortunately, in
They
this
see
country,
it.
in this country, a lot of people don't see it like that because, look, I'm sure you've both spent enough time in the United States to know that, what people are taught here from a very early age is that America is exceptional. There's never been a country like the United States ever in history. We're the sort of shining example of freedom and democracy, and democracy is constantly under threat. So we have to, take these measures to so it's difficult to sometimes talk to people, who are so busy waving the flag in front of their face they can't see what's going on the other side of it. The younger people don't seem to be as susceptible to that nonsense, which is why, not that I'm a huge user of TikTok, but come on, we're trying now. They've banned TikTok, for God's sakes, and the only reason they got rid of TikTok is because it's not an American-owned company. That it's not like Facebook or Twitter X or whatever. It's owned by the Chinese government, so therefore it must be evil. The hypocrisy of that is pretty obvious to me. I mean, do you ever go on TikTok? I mean, it's mostly silly stuff. It's hardly the hotbed of political discourse. I mean, seriously, come on, let's be reasonable here. It's like silly people doing dances and all kinds of silliness going on there. But anyway.
I barely go on TikTok, but can I just say what's going on in the campuses in America is one of the most inspiring things that has happened over the last few months and years. And my God, we need it. I mean, it is important nonetheless to point out that it is happening in American universities. You are not finding similar things happen in European universities. And I completely accept what you say, that Americans are indoctrinated in the idea of exceptionalism, and that they wave their flags, that they tend to be very uncritical about what the American government does. But nonetheless, one has found in the past that a point does come when, especially young Americans, who are often the start of this, start to realize what is being done and done in their name, and say, no, we can't agree to this. Now, I remember the Vietnam protests of the 60s. Of course, I was a tiny child then, but I do remember them. And I remember them even better in the 70s when they were still ongoing and, in fact, got larger. So I remember them, and I remember how young Americans felt at that time. Of course, there were reasons. There was a risk that they would be drafted and would go back to fight. But, of course, opposition to Vietnam began in the United States, and then eventually, after a time lag, spread to Europe. And maybe, just maybe, the same will happen with these protests in the United States. Now, I'm going to make a guess. The authorities in America are far less secure today, or feel less secure than they did in the 60s. They will act much more ruthlessly to suppress these protests.
Oh, yes.
You were already talking about the police presences and things of that kind. They've developed all kinds of techniques that didn't exist in the 60s, like withdrawing people's bank accounts and threatening them in that kind of way. But doing all of those things ultimately shows how very insecure they are. In the 60s, they didn't feel as insecure as they do today. So the protests do exist. People clearly do have access to information. They're far more informed about the Palestinian conflict than they are about the Ukrainian one. And one shouldn't be surprised about that, because this conflict in Palestine has continued for so much longer. And of course, in New York, there's a particular reason why there would be protests, very strong protests there, because there's such a big Jewish community in New York, and many people within that Jewish community, including, by the way, Naomi Klein, are very opposed to what is happening.
Oh, yes.
I mean, she's spoken up very strongly against it. So you can see why that might be happening there. But I'm afraid, I think it will be suppressed, one form or another. But the fact that it's happening shows both the fragility, the brittleness of the system, and the fact that there are people, especially in the United States, who are prepared to stand up and oppose it.
Well, it should also be pointed out that although the catalyst for these protests is clearly the circumstances for the Palestinians, the atrocities, really, it's the genocide. I mean, let's just call it for what it is. It's also a realization that, people are fed up with, like, not in my name. You hear that quite a lot. It's not just about Gaza. It's about this American constant, funding for wars all around the world that people are just fed up with, and they're sort of saying, like, 41% of my tax dollars are going to bomb people in Gaza and other people around the world. Meanwhile, like, the roads in my street are, as bumpy as a road in some faraway place in some other country, which is underdeveloped. Don't mean to be discriminatory when I say that, but you know what I mean? Like, look, I want to let you guys go pretty soon, but I'd like both of you to just weigh in, sort of last parting thoughts. Let's start with you, Alexander.
I think you put your finger on a very important point and a major difference with the 60s. In the 60s, the West was going through an enormous economic upswing. I mean, there was economic affluence and prosperity on a scale that one had never seen. It was a time when people felt very self-confident and very buoyant. And that, of course, affected the mood of authority as well. That was why they were prepared to tolerate protests in a way that they do not tolerate them today. Today, on the contrary, we have economic crisis in Europe, and I don't think that's an overstatement at all. Difficult economic conditions in the United States, and these protests are happening against a backdrop of general disaffection. And of course, people are perhaps starting to make the connections, which emphatically do exist, between foreign policy and economic realities. There's a bizarre article, just to say, this morning in The Guardian in Britain by the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, talking about the economic crisis in Europe, the fact that there's zero growth there. And nowhere does he say, not once, not in a single sentence, that the fact that we've cut ourselves off from a cheap, reliable Russian gas has any part to play in this. You wouldn't know about the sanctions. You wouldn't know about the gas cut off. You wouldn't know anything about this if you read him. So, but, the very fact that he's not able to say it or discuss it tells you that the political class knows that there is this bubbling dissatisfaction and anger. Now, at the moment, it's not broken through. And I don't think these protests are enough to cause it to break through. But at some point, if this continues, and it's difficult to see why it would not continue, it will burst, it will break through. And of course, the one story about empires is, and again, I know this from Britain, when the people at the core of the empire no longer support it, are no longer prepared to bear the burdens and the sacrifices of keeping it going, because they know perfectly well that they're bearing the burdens, but only a few other people are gaining the benefits or presumed benefits, then empires die. That is what happened to Britain. It was when soldiers from Britain were no longer prepared to go and fight in India or Malaysia or Africa or wherever to keep the thing operating. And I think in the United States, we're not far from that point also.
Yeah, I agree. Just my final thoughts is I think that even people that don't have a good understanding or a clear understanding of say, the situation in Gaza and in Israel, and especially in Ukraine and Russia, they do have a sense. I do believe that more people have a sense that something is going horribly wrong, and perhaps the U.S. is not on the right side of history. I think they do have that sense, or more and more they are starting to obtain that sense that perhaps they are the baddies, as that meme always likes to spell out. And at the end of the day, people are also starting to understand that the run of the dollar as the reserve currency and the power of the dollar is also coming to an end. I mean, people definitely in the United States, they understand that the country's 35 trillion in debt. As you said, Malcolm, they're able to look out their window and see the decay. They're able to listen to people like Tucker Carlson, who comes back from Moscow and says, Moscow's a really nice city. It's really well put together. It's very organized.
Tucker to say that. You said that last year.
I said that, but Tucker also confirmed it. Tucker confirmed it. And it's true. You can hate Putin all you want, and you can hate Russia all you want. It doesn't change the fact that when you go to a city like Moscow or St. Petersburg, or I'm sure many cities in China as well, that these are well-run, well-organized, very, very technologically advanced, very prosperous, very clean, very safe places, and very happy places, and very secure places. I mean, people travel. They're seeing the world. They're interacting. They know people who are traveling and seeing the world and coming back to them and saying, I was in China last month. Someone can tell them, I went to China last month, and I can tell you it's really nice. These things cut through. They break through. It takes time, but they do break through.
Yeah. Well, it's the secret that our media and our government here in this country want to keep kind of quiet. They don't want people to know that they're living as a friend.
I always say this, just a final thought. I always say this: the reason the West, one of the first things they did with the conflict in Russia, one of the first things they did was to cut the travel to Russia, is because they want to make sure that they cut the lines of communication between the people, not the governments, between the people. Right. They don't want people talking. They don't want people communicating. They don't want people saying, Russians are not bad. And they don't want the Russians saying, well, Germans are not bad, or people in France are not bad. They don't want that. They want people to hate each other. Yes. That's why they cut off the travel.
And they don't want people to go there and to see what it really is like, which was very obvious during the World Cup when the British government tried to stop British fans from going to Russia. Can I just say on this topic, by the way, and just sign of how nervous the authorities, the people in power are. Apparently, there is a Rand Corporation report coming out tomorrow, which is talking about the United States being in a state of accelerating decline. Now that's Rand, which is about as central to the power system as it can possibly get. David Ignatius in the Washington Post has written about it today. So the fragility and the nervousness is there. There don't seem to be many solutions within the system about how to cope with it. Their instinct, therefore, is to tighten control and to double down, which is what empires always do at their very end. But as I said, if the faith of the people is gone, then all is lost.
Well, I mean, Kingston, where I am, it's a relatively small city, about just under 100 miles north of New York City. There's a homeless crisis in this town, let alone New York City. I mean, it's there's tent cities everywhere. There's discussions about how to deal with homelessness. Should these people be arrested for being homeless? Give somebody $100 ticket for being homeless. The lack of beds for homeless people, how unhoused, I think, is the politically correct word these days. But that's just one example. I mean, there's so many. My father, who's in his early 90s now, fortunately lives in Canada, and when he got ill, I was just, I went back there and I was so amazed, like just the difference between the healthcare opportunities, like compared to what I hear, people having to pay $16,000 a month for an elder care institution. It's just, yeah. Well, anyway, look, it's been a fascinating conversation as always with you both. I'm grateful for you for having shared the time, and I look forward to having you back on the program in a little while. Maybe let's not leave it quite so long. That was too long. But I watch you guys every day, and I urge all my listeners to go to the Duran and also to your individual Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou. Both have their fantastic YouTube channels where you're still able to find alternate views to the ones that were being force-fed by our media. So I thank you greatly for your constant hard work, for bringing us alternate views of what's happening out there. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a great pleasure, and let's definitely meet again.
Okay. Cheers. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye.